You think I'm a fool? That bastard isn't mine." The words were a spray of broken glass in the hushed antiseptic corridor of Chicago's Mercy Hospital. They were vile, final, and aimed with a brutal precision designed to shatter. Julian Vance, his face a mask of aristocratic fury, loomed over the hospital bed, his voice climbing with each syllable. "A maid? A goddamn maid from the slums? You really think I'd fall for this pathetic, desperate little trap?" His laugh was a dry, ugly sound that echoed off the polished linoleum floors. If you're already feeling the fire of Ilara's quiet strength and the ice of this man's cruelty, smash that like button and comment where you're tuning in from. Let's see how far her story travels, because this is just the beginning of a storm you won't want to miss. Ilara Sanchez, just 28 but feeling 1,000 years old, sat motionless. A protective wall of silence was the only defense she had left. Her arms were a fierce cradle around her newborn son, Leo. Her hands trembled, a traitorous tremor betraying the storm raging inside her. But her hold on the baby was absolute, a promise whispered in touch. Her eyes, bloodshot and swollen, weren't from the agony of childbirth. They were from the agony of this. She didn't answer him. Her lips were pressed into a thin white line, a dam holding back a flood of words that would do no good. Her body curled instinctively forward, a mother shielding her young from a predator. "I came here to see this for myself," Julian continued, pacing the small room like a caged wolf. His expensive Italian shoes clicked a sharp, impatient rhythm on the floor. "To make sure you never, ever try to pull this garbage again." "Julian." Ilara's voice was a ghost, a rasp of exhaustion and grief. "Please, just look at him." "I did look," he snapped, his gaze flicking toward the bundle with contempt. "He looks like every other screaming brat in this place, a prop in your little sob story." Ilara shifted her grip, turning the baby almost imperceptibly. A sliver of morning light, weak and gray through the Chicago smog, sliced through the window and fell across Leo's face. And that's when it happened, a glitch in the matrix of his absolute certainty. Julian saw them, the eyes. That eerie, unmistakable silver blue, a color like a winter storm over Lake Michigan, so rare, so specific, it was practically a Vance family signature. He saw them every morning in his own reflection. He'd seen them in portraits of his father and his grandfather before him. His gaze, against his will, drifted down to the baby's skin. Pale, creamy, a stark contrast to Ilara's beautiful olive tone, and far too light to be easily dismissed. His heart, that tightly controlled muscle, skipped a single betraying beat. A hiccup of doubt in a man who had built an empire on unwavering self-assurance. But then he blinked, a physical act of will, shaking his head as if to dislodge the thought. He looked away, focusing on a crack in the plaster wall. "Nah," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Coincidence? Genetics are a mess. It doesn't mean a damn thing." The world seemed to hold its breath in that half-second. Time itself froze. Ilara watched him. She saw the flicker of recognition, the tiny crack forming in the towering fortress of his denial before he sealed it over with concrete and steel. A soft, wounded sound escaped her throat, half a sob, half an exhale of breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She bent her head, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead, then held him tighter, as if the force of her love could somehow make the pain of his father's rejection hurt less. "You planned this," Julian snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss as he leaned in closer. "You probably slept with some other lowlife and figured you'd pin it on me. Thought it was your golden ticket out of the gutter, didn't you?" His words were poison darts. Ilara flinched, but she didn't look up. Her world had shrunk to the warm, breathing weight in her arms. People were watching now. Nurses paused at the doorway. Other patients peeked out of their rooms. Visitors waiting for news on their own. Loved ones stared openly. But none of them stepped in. No one questioned the powerful white billionaire in a $1,000 coat berating the Hispanic woman in a cheap, paper-thin hospital gown. In their eyes, the story was already written. "You think because you cleaned my toilets that gives you the right to ruin my name?" Julian's face was inches from hers now, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and contempt. "You're trash. I gave you a job, a roof over your head for a while, and this is how you repay me? You're not just a liar, you're delusional." The whispers started then, growing like mold on damp walls. "She's just trying to trap him. I bet she did it on purpose. She should be ashamed." Ilara heard every word. Still, she said nothing. She closed her eyes, letting the tears finally come. Not the loud, dramatic sobs of a woman seeking pity. These were different. Silent, heavy, exhausted tears that streaked down her face and soaked into the hospital blanket. She didn't fight back. There was no point. The war had already been fought and lost in a dark room months ago. What remained now was survival. Her mind, seeking escape, drifted back. It wasn't a conscious choice, but a desperate flight from the unbearable present. Flashes of the past ignited behind her closed eyelids. The winter gala at the Lake Forest estate, marble halls glowing under the weight of crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the sound of hollow laughter and clinking glasses. And Julian, his face flushed with bourbon, calling her into his private study because he'd spilled a drink. "Ilara, you're different," he'd slurred, leaning heavily against the ornate doorframe, his tie loosened, his silver blue eyes clouded with something she couldn't name. "Not like the others. You just listen." She had stood frozen in the doorway, her maid's apron still on, her hands clutching a cleaning rag. Unsure. Afraid. He'd taken a step closer, the scent of expensive liquor rolling off him. "It's so damn lonely," he'd murmured, his voice losing its commanding edge, becoming something smaller, more broken. "People only love the idea of me. They only love me when I'm winning." She remembered the shocking gentleness of his touch as his fingers brushed her cheek, the false softness in his voice, the promises whispered in that dark, opulent room. "I wouldn't hurt you," he had said. "You're safe here." Safe. The word was a bitter joke now. That same night, after he'd taken what he wanted, he'd left her in the silence of a guest room she had cleaned 100 times. No word of remorse. No acknowledgement. The next day, she folded his shirts and polished his silver as if nothing had happened, her body a museum of secret aches. Weeks later, when the 2 pink lines appeared on a cheap drugstore test, she had gathered every scrap of courage she possessed to tell him. She remembered standing in the long gravel driveway of the estate, the plastic test clutched in her hand. He'd barely looked at it, his focus on his phone. "You're joking," he'd said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I haven't been with anyone else, Julian," she had replied, her voice trembling but firm. He'd rolled his eyes, a gesture of supreme dismissal, and pulled out his checkbook. "Get rid of it," he'd said flatly, the words as cold and clean as a surgeon's scalpel. He scribbled a number, tore out the check, and held it out to her. $50,000. "And don't come back." No argument, no hesitation, just a check and the slam of a heavy oak door. Now, 9 months later, here they were, and he still didn't believe her. "Go ahead," he growled, yanking off his leather gloves and tossing them on the chair. "Call the press, call a lawyer. You'll get nothing. This," he gestured dismissively towards the baby, "is not mine." "You saw his eyes, Julian," Ilara said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. It was soft, but it cut through the air. The same silver blue as yours. You can lie to the world, but you can't lie to yourself forever." He scoffed and turned away, striding towards the door. "I see what I want to see. And what I see is a liar trying to scam her way into a trust fund." "Then leave," Elara said quietly. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't break. It simply sliced. "If you have no heart, no soul, then go. I won't beg for a shred of your humanity." Julian paused at the door, his back to her. For a fraction of a second, he looked back. His gaze fell on her, then on the baby, and for a dizzying moment, he saw those eyes again in his mind's eye, a color that should not exist twice by chance. But he said nothing. He stepped out, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. The moment it closed, Elara let out a sob she'd been holding in for hours, maybe for her entire life. She buried her face into Leo's tiny, warm body, rocking back and forth, as if the motion could somehow soothe the gaping wound in her soul. The baby stirred, then settled against her, a small anchor in a raging sea. She whispered through her tears, her voice thick with a fierce, unbreakable promise. "You are not a mistake. You are not a trap. You are my reason." Outside, Julian Vance stood under the hospital's concrete awning as the first flakes of a surprise late spring snow began to fall, soft and slow, melting on the grim Chicago pavement. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled check he had written months ago, the one his bank had informed him was never cashed. He'd kept it, creased and worn from months of being folded and refolded in his wallet, a constant, irritating reminder of his denial. For a long moment he stared at it. Then, with a sigh that felt like it was ripped from his lungs, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall from his hand like dead leaves. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that tearing up the paper changed nothing. Inside him, the storm had only just begun. 2 years earlier, the Vance estate was a fortress of silence, secluded deep within the manicured old money hills of Lake Forest, Illinois. The limestone mansion stretched across 10 acres of emerald lawns, marble patios that gleamed in the sun, and glass-walled rooms filled with expensive, soulless art. Everything sparkled, but everything echoed with emptiness. Elara Sanchez had been working there for 3 months. She was a ghost in the machine of the house, quiet, efficient, and invisible, just the way the job required. Her life was a silent ballet of servitude. Each morning began before sunrise. By 5 a.m., she'd be folding monogrammed towels that were rarely used, wiping down untouched crystal surfaces, and prepping a specific single-origin coffee for a man who barely acknowledged her existence. Julian Vance didn't speak unless it was a command. Polish the floors again. Don't leave fingerprints on the glass. Have the East Wing guest suite ready by 5. Elara had learned his rhythms, his preferences, the silent language of his displeasure. She knew he liked his ties hung by color, from lightest to darkest. She knew he preferred his strawberries, with the stems cut at a precise 45-degree angle. She also knew that he never, ever smiled. Not once. On the outside, Julian Vance was the embodiment of the American dream. A self-made billionaire tech icon, the CEO of Vance Dynamics, a company that had revolutionized global logistics. But behind the scenes, he was a machine. Cold, sharp, and dangerously, profoundly bored. That winter gala changed everything. It was mid-December. The estate was flooded with the city's elite, executives, politicians, socialites, and actors. The air buzzed with privilege, ambition, and expensive champagne. Elara moved through the event like a shadow, floating from room to room with trays of canapés and forced, polite smiles that never reached her eyes. Later that night, long after the last Bentley had crunched down the gravel driveway, Julian called her into his private study. "Alara," he slurred from the depths of a massive leather armchair, a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand, his custom-tailored shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. "Come in." She hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, do you need something cleaned?" He waved the question away with a limp hand. "Sit." Her hands tightened on the empty tray she still held. "Sir, I said sit." His voice was soft, but the command was steel beneath velvet. The study smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and whiskey. A vintage record player hummed something low and melancholy in the corner, a lone saxophone crying in the dark. Outside, snow was falling in thick, silent curtains, muffling the world. Julian took a long, slow sip from his glass, then looked at her with a gaze she didn't recognize. It wasn't cold, it wasn't commanding, it was empty. A black hole. "Do you know what it's like?" he said suddenly, his words slurring together. "To have everything, every single thing you could ever want, and still feel like nothing?" Alara didn't respond. What could she say? He laughed, a bitter, self-loathing sound. "Of course you don't. You still believe in things. In people, in purpose. That's cute." She started to rise, a quiet retreat her only instinct. But he reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip wasn't violent, not forceful, just enough to stop her. "You listen," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "You're different. You don't fawn. You don't pretend. You don't want anything from me. You just exist. It's nice." "I think I should go," Alara said softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why?" he asked, his silver blue eyes searching hers. "Afraid I'll hurt you." "No," she whispered, the words surprising even herself. "I'm afraid you won't remember." That line hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. Julian leaned in, his breath a potent mix of bourbon and grief. "I don't forget things that matter," he murmured. And then he kissed her. It wasn't smooth or romantic. It was sudden, clumsy, searching, a desperate act of a drowning man. And Alara, caught in a vortex of fear, confusion, and a strange, aching loneliness of her own, didn't pull away. Later, lying alone in the guest room she had cleaned and prepared 100 times, Alara stared at the ornate ceiling, her heart beating a frantic, deafening rhythm. He didn't speak to her the next morning. Or the next. Weeks passed. The house returned to its silent, echoing routine. Nothing changed. Until the 2 pink lines on the test changed everything. When she finally found the courage to tell him, she waited until the end of the day, when the house was quiet, and he was alone on the back patio, staring out at the frozen lake. He barely looked up from his phone as she approached. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words feeling small and fragile in the vast, cold air. He paused for just a second, his thumb hovering over the screen, then returned to scrolling. "You're joking." "I'm not." He laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that says, "You are beneath me." "Come on, Alara. You really expect me to believe that?" "I haven't been with anyone else," she said. Her voice trembled, but her spine stayed straight. He stood then, towering over her, his jaw tight with irritation. "You think I'm going to fall for this? You think I'll just nod my head and hand over a blank check? I know your type." "My type?" The words were a choked whisper. Desperate, calculating. You saw an opportunity and you took it. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry in front of him. "I trusted you," she said, her voice cracking. He pulled his wallet out and tossed a business card at her feet. It landed face down on the cold stone. "My lawyer's name is on there. You want money? Talk to him. But don't ever come back here. His voice was ice. You're dismissed, Ilara. She left that night. No severance, no letter of recommendation, just the stinging memory of a man who had called her different and then treated her like disposable trash. Back in the present, Ilara sat alone in the sterile hospital room. Her baby, Leo, slept peacefully in the plastic bassinet beside her. The room smelled of antiseptic and baby powder, a strange combination of clinical cold and profound new life. Outside, the snow fell gently against the window pane. Her body ached, but her heart ached more. She reached out, touching Leo's cheek with the back of her fingers. He stirred slightly, his perfect lips parting in a dreamlike sigh. She remembered every cruel word Julian had said just hours earlier. But she also remembered that half-second, that fracture in his certainty when he saw Leo's eyes. His eyes. He didn't believe her, not with his mind. But somewhere deeper, in a place he refused to acknowledge, he wasn't sure anymore. And doubt, she knew, was a powerful, insidious thing. Ilara leaned forward, pressing another kiss to her son's head. You are not a tool, she whispered. You are not a weapon. You are not a lie. You are truth, wrapped in soft skin and tiny, perfect fists. You are light, my beautiful boy, even if he refuses to see it. She turned toward the window and watched the snow fall, each flake a tiny, frozen tear, blanketing the grimy city in a temporary, deceptive purity. Outside, somewhere far from this room, Julian Vance sat alone in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, staring at his own reflection in the tinted glass. He couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. That impossible, damning silver blue. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something unfamiliar and terrifying stirring in the frozen tundra of his chest. Doubt. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It simply whispered his name. The storm outside had calmed, but inside Ilara's small apartment in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, winter pressed in through thin walls and rattling window frames. Leo lay bundled in second-hand blankets, a patchwork quilt of charity and kindness, his tiny chest rising and falling with the fragile, precious rhythm of sleep. Ilara sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of lukewarm tea in her hands, staring at the folded paper on the table before her. The check. $50,000. It had been crisp and insulting when he'd first thrown it at her. Now it was creased and soft from months of being shoved into drawers, pulled out, stared at, and cursed at. She had never cashed it. To do so would have felt like an admission, an agreement with Julian that her son was nothing but an inconvenience, a problem to be erased with money. She reached for the check now, holding it between her fingers. In the dim light of the single bare bulb overhead, her reflection shimmered faintly in the dark window. She saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weary pull of her mouth, her hair pulled back in a messy, functional bun. But she also saw a strength she barely recognized, a hardness in her jaw that hadn't been there before. Her neighbor, Maria Rodriguez, knocked lightly before letting herself in, a familiar and welcome intrusion. A widow in her 60s with a soft Spanish accent and a wisdom as sharp as chili peppers, she had taken Ilara under her wing since she'd moved into the building, pregnant and alone. She carried a pot of chicken soup, steam rising from it like a gentle, fragrant promise. "You need to eat, mija," Maria said, her voice warm and firm. She set the pot on the small stove and studied Ilara's exhausted expression. "What is it now? What's troubling that heart of yours?" Ilara held up the check. "He gave me this before Leo was born, told me to get rid of it, told me I was lying." Maria's lips tightened into a grim line. Men like him think money is a bandage for the soul. They think it can fix anything it breaks. He came to the hospital, Ilara whispered, her voice cracking on the memory. He looked right at Leo, at his eyes, and he still said he wasn't his. But Maria... For just a moment, he stopped. He saw something. I know he did. Maria ladled the steaming soup into a bowl and set it in front of her. You don't need his belief to raise that beautiful boy, Ilara. You need your own. Ilara swallowed against the lump in her throat. She reached down to touch Leo's tiny hand where it peeked from the edge of the blanket. I know, but how do I explain to my son when he's older why his father denied him from the moment he was born? You explain it by showing him that you never did, Maria said gently, her hand coming to rest on Ilara's shoulder. You chose him. You fought for him. In the story of his life, you are the hero. That is enough. The words were a balm, but the ache in her chest lingered. She thought again of Julian's face at the hospital, that flicker of recognition, so quickly buried under a mountain of arrogance. That flicker haunted her. It was a seed of hope she couldn't stop herself from watering. Across town, Julian Vance sat in his penthouse office, a glass fortress overlooking the glittering expanse of downtown Chicago. The checkbook lay open on his massive glass desk. He had ripped up the first check outside the hospital, a moment of theatrical rage. But now he had written another, this one for an even larger sum. $100,000. His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, stood across from him, arms folded. If you want this to go away, Julian, then make it go away, Marcus said, his voice smooth and pragmatic. Money talks. She's a single mother working a dead-end job. She won't resist forever. Julian rubbed his temples, a headache pounding behind his eyes. She's stubborn. She didn't take the first one. Then she's bluffing, holding out for more, Marcus replied without hesitation. This is a negotiation. If the press ever gets wind of this, we can spin it. You've always been untouchable. But if you pay her quietly now, it never has to leave the shadows. Julian leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather groaning. For the first time, the idea of being untouchable felt hollow, fragile. He had built his entire life on control, on bending the world and the people in it to his will. Yet one woman, a woman he had dismissed as nothing, and one tiny child, had unsettled him in a way no boardroom rival or corporate takeover ever had. He saw those eyes again, that pale, perfect skin. He remembered his father's voice, a cold rasp from his childhood. Never let them see your weakness, boy. Weakness makes you prey. But was this doubt a weakness? Or was it truth, clawing its way to the surface? He shoved the thought away, back into the dark corners of his mind. Draft the paperwork, he muttered to Marcus. Send it. The next morning, Ilara opened her door to find a sleek, black envelope had been slid underneath it. Inside was another check, double the first, and a typed letter, cold and impersonal. Take this money and move on. Do not contact me or my office again. This is the final offer. Ilara crumpled the letter in her fist. Tears of pure rage burned her eyes. She wasn't surprised. Julian was predictable in his arrogance, but the fresh insult cut deeper than before. He thought her silence could be bought. He thought Leo could be erased, a mistake on a balance sheet to be corrected with a wire transfer. She carried the envelope downstairs, her steps firm, and tossed it straight into the overflowing public trash bin on the corner of her street. Then she picked up Leo from his crib, holding him close, and whispered fiercely into his soft hair, "You will not be his dirty little secret." Later that day, Ilara was back at her part-time shift at a corner diner in the neighborhood. The neon sign buzzed erratically. The air smelled of grease and stale coffee, and her feet ached from hours of standing. Still, she kept her head high. Leo was sleeping in a borrowed crib at Maria's apartment, safe for the moment. As she wiped down a sticky counter, she overheard two men in a booth whispering just a little too loudly. "You hear about that billionaire's maid? The one claiming he's the father?" "Yeah, she's crazy. Women like that, always looking for a payout." Ilara's stomach twisted into a tight, sick knot, but she forced herself not to react. This was her life now. Judgment from strangers who knew nothing but salacious headlines waiting to be written. Whispers in the dark that chipped away at her dignity, piece by piece. When her shift finally ended, she walked home through the falling snow. Her coat was too thin for the biting Chicago wind, but she pulled it tighter and kept moving. Above her, Christmas lights blinked weakly in apartment windows. The world felt both cruel and beautiful all at once. Back in his office, Julian poured himself another drink. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself she was a liar, manipulative, a danger to his empire. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw Leo's face, not Ilara's face, not anyone else's face, his own, staring back at him in miniature. He drained the glass in one long swallow, but the image did not fade. In Pilsen, Ilara sat by Leo's crib, humming a soft lullaby. It was a song her mother had sung to her, back when life was simpler, when dignity wasn't a daily battle to be won. Leo stirred, opened his eyes for a brief, sleepy second. Stormy, silver-blue eyes. Ilara smiled, though tears still tracked down her face. "He can deny you all he wants," she whispered, "but truth has a way of shining through the cracks." The night settled heavy around them. Two souls, one clinging to the brittle fortress of denial, the other to the fragile flame of hope, both bound by a child who carried more than just blood in his veins. He carried the weight of a justice yet to come. And somewhere deep inside, in the growing cracks of his certainty, Julian Vance carried something he could not shake. The gnawing suspicion that the life he had tried so desperately to erase was the very one that might expose who he truly was. What would you do in her shoes? Would you cash the check or fight for the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss how this story unfolds. The first Sunday of February dawned gray and unforgiving over Chicago. The streets were damp from last night's sleet, littered with old newspapers that clung to the curbs like discarded confessions. Ilara pushed Leo's stroller slowly toward the small brick church at the corner of 18th and Ashland. She wasn't sure why she was going. She hadn't set foot inside a church in years. But something deep in her chest ached for refuge, for words stronger than the whispers of neighbors or the taunts of strangers at the diner. Inside, the sanctuary was warm, lit by soft golden lamps and the faint jeweled glow of stained glass windows, depicting saints who looked as weary as she felt. The congregation was small but alive. Elderly women in bright hats, children fidgeting in the pews, men nodding to the rhythm of the gospel choir. Ilara slid quietly into the back row, rocking Leo gently as the pastor's voice rolled over them, a tide of faith and promise. After the service, as people mingled, sharing greetings and coffee, an older woman approached her. She was tall and regal, with skin like polished mahogany, and eyes that carried the wisdom of decades of storms weathered and survived. She wore a simple gray coat and carried herself with a kind of innate dignity that wealth could never purchase. "You're Ilara," the woman said, her voice both a question and a statement. Ilara blinked, surprised. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," the woman replied, a small, knowing smile curving her lips. "My name's Loretta Johnson. I run the food pantry down on Blue Island Avenue. I heard your story. Truth has a way of traveling, even when people try to twist it." Ilara stiffened, her body automatically bracing for judgment. But Loretta's eyes softened as she looked down at Leo, who was cooing softly in his stroller. "He's got eyes like a storm rolling in off the lake," Loretta murmured. "I've seen that color before. It's rare, strong, can't be hidden." Ilara swallowed hard. She wanted to believe those words meant something, that they were a sign, but she had learned to expect doubt, not affirmation. "People say I'm lying," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They say I'm trying to trap him." Loretta's gaze sharpened, cutting through Ilara's fear. "Let them say what they will. The truth don't need their permission to exist, child. The truth just stands. It stands even when men with money and power try to bury it under a mountain of lies." Ilara lowered her head. "I don't know how to keep standing. I'm so tired." Loretta reached out, placing a weathered, comforting hand over Ilara's. "You stand because that boy needs you to. You stand because every woman before you who was told she was nothing refused to lie down and be walked on. Don't you see? You're not just fighting for him. You're fighting for your own soul." The words settled deep into Ilara's chest, heavy yet strangely freeing. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen. Not as a liar, not as a scandal, but as a mother doing her best in a world designed to break women like her. That evening, she visited the food pantry Loretta ran. The shelves were lined with cans of beans and boxes of pasta. The walls covered with photographs of families helped over the years. Loretta introduced her to volunteers, to other single mothers, to neighbors who smiled at Leo without a trace of judgment. For a moment, the crushing weight on Ilara's shoulders eased. "You are not alone in this," Loretta said firmly, as if she could read the doubt still clouding Ilara's mind. "You remember that." Meanwhile, across town, Julian Vance's life spun in a different, colder orbit. He sat in the private dining room of a Michelin-starred steakhouse on the Gold Coast, surrounded by investors and politicians. His laughter was rehearsed, his wine glass always half full. On the surface, he was the picture of untouchable success, but beneath the table, his foot tapped a restless, frantic rhythm against the floor. He heard Loretta's words in his head, though he had never met her, only the echo of what Ilara had whispered in the hospital. "He has your eyes." He replayed the image of the baby in his mind, over and over. Those storm-gray, silver-blue eyes had followed him into every boardroom, every elevator, every empty penthouse night since he'd walked out of that hospital. At one point, an investor leaned across the table, his face slick with wine and ambition. "Julian, you look distracted. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Julian lied smoothly. He smiled that perfected, predatory smile, the one that hid the cracks in his foundation like fresh paint over rotting wood. But when he returned to his penthouse, the mask slipped. He poured a glass of whiskey and sat alone, staring out at the indifferent skyline. The city lights glittered, a carpet of diamonds at his feet, yet none of them could ease the shadow that had taken root in his chest. He had built his entire empire on certainty, on knowing. Now, for the first time, he wasn't certain of anything. Back in Pilsen, Ilara wrote in the journal she kept for Leo after putting him to sleep. She wrote about Loretta's words, about the strength she hadn't known she carried, about the flicker of fire that was starting to burn again inside her. "You are not a mistake," she wrote to her sleeping son. "You are not shame. You are my truth. And one day, your father will have to see it too, whether he wants to or not." Days turned into weeks. Ilara worked double shifts at the diner, her body aching, but her spirit steadier. Loretta checked in often, bringing meals, reminding her to rest, reminding her that her dignity was not something a billionaire could erase with a check. One evening, as Ilara walked home, a group of teenagers on the corner sneered. "There's the liar," one of them muttered. "Baby mama of the rich dude," another laughed. "Bet she's just after his wallet." Ilara's steps faltered for a second, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, her head held high, Loretta's words echoing in her mind. The truth don't need their permission. At home, she held Leo close, pressing her cheek against his soft hair. "One day," she whispered, her voice fierce with promise, "you'll know how hard I fought to protect you. You'll know the truth, no matter what anyone says." And though her body trembled with weariness, her heartbeat was steady with a newfound resolve. Across the river, in his glass tower, Julian stood in front of a full-length mirror. He stared at his own eyes, silver blue and unyielding. Then he saw Leo's face flash across his mind like a ghost, carrying the same impossible gaze. He poured another drink, but this time it didn't wash the vision away. And as the city settled into the deep silence of night, two lives moved in parallel, one clinging to power, the other clinging to hope, both inextricably bound by a child whose very existence would soon force their separate worlds to collide again, with the force of a tidal wave. The spring thaw in Chicago brought no blossoms of ease for Ilara. The streets were still bruised and gray from winter, slush clinging to the curbs, the scent of exhaust heavy in the air. Yet inside her small apartment, life pulsed with a steady, quiet warmth. Leo had learned to smile, a crooked, heart-stopping grin that stretched wide whenever Ilara leaned over his crib. His laugh, light and sudden like a burst of sunshine, was the kind of sound that could stitch up the cracks in a weary heart. One Saturday morning, sunlight finally broke through the dusty window as Ilara dressed Leo in a clean, second-hand onesie. She lifted him up and kissed his chubby cheek, savoring the simple, profound joy of his warmth. Just then, Maria knocked on the door and stepped inside, carrying a bag of groceries from the local market. "Look at you, big boy," the older woman cooed, reaching for Leo. "You're growing so fast you'll be a man before we know it." Ilara smiled, a genuine smile, grateful for the constant, unwavering support. While Maria held Leo, she pulled out her phone. The sight of them together, the wise, loving elder and the bright-eyed child, made her pause. On instinct, she lifted the phone and snapped a quick photo. Leo's silver-blue eyes sparkled in the morning light, his small fist curled tightly against Maria's shoulder. She didn't plan to share it with anyone. But when Loretta called later to check in, Ilara, feeling a surge of pride, sent her the picture with a short message. "He's doing well today. Thank you for everything." Loretta, beaming, showed the photo to one of the young pantry volunteers, a girl savvy with social media. The volunteer, in turn, posted it on a small community Facebook page for the neighborhood with a simple caption. "Look at this beautiful boy from our community. Let's show him some love." Within hours, the image began to spread, shared first among neighbors, then friends of friends, and eventually strangers. No one knew the child's last name or his story, but the comments poured in. "Beautiful boy. Look at those incredible eyes. He's so special." The innocent post, meant only to share a moment of local joy, had become a tiny digital spark cast into a vast, dry forest. The next morning, Julian Vance was being driven to a high-stakes meeting, scrolling absently through his phone, a habit to avoid thinking. His thumb stopped mid-swipe. There, buried in a trending thread on a news aggregator, was the photograph. Leo, smiling in the sunlight, his eyes like shards of a stormy sky. Julian's chest tightened as if a fist had clenched around his heart. The resemblance, captured so clearly in the high-resolution image, was undeniable, irrefutable. He had seen those eyes staring back at him in the mirror his entire life. He zoomed in, his finger trembling slightly, staring until the edges of the screen blurred. "Sir?" the driver asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right?" Julian shoved the phone into his pocket, his knuckles white. "Just drive." But nothing felt all right. That evening, instead of celebrating another successful corporate conquest with investors, Julian found himself pouring a drink in the silence of his penthouse, staring again at the photograph on his tablet. Doubt wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar that refused to be silenced. He remembered his father, stern and unyielding, demanding perfection. Weakness makes you pray. The memory tangled with the sight of the boy's face. His son's face. Julian slammed the glass down on the marble counter. He couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. Meanwhile, Elara returned home from her shift at the diner, completely unaware of the storm she had unintentionally unleashed. She fed Leo, rocked him, and whispered stories about the future, about schools and playgrounds and summers filled with laughter. She dreamed aloud for him, even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. Her phone began to buzz with messages from friends she hadn't heard from in years. "Is this your baby? He's beautiful." Some congratulated her. Others pried with curiosity. A few comments carried the familiar venom. "Trying to get attention? You know everyone's talking about you, right?" Elara ignored them all. She focused on Leo's steady breathing, the way his small fingers wrapped around hers with absolute, unconditional trust. But Julian did not ignore the photo. The next day, he appeared, unannounced, at the community clinic where Elara sometimes volunteered with Loretta, hoping to give back in small ways. She was in the back supply room, sorting donated baby clothes, when she heard the commotion outside. Hushed voices, the sound of someone insisting on being let through. When she stepped out, her heart stopped dead in her chest. Julian stood in the middle of the waiting area, flanked by two stone-faced security aides. His eyes, cold and searching, swept the room until they landed on her. "Elara," he said, his voice low and heavy with command. The room went silent. Every pair of eyes, mothers with sick children, elderly patients, nurses, turned towards them. Loretta stepped forward, a protective lioness, but Elara raised a hand to stop her. "What are you doing here?" Elara asked, her voice shaking but firm. Julian's gaze flicked toward the stroller beside her, where Leo sat awake, wide-eyed and curious. Their eyes met, the father and the son, and for a split second, Julian faltered. He quickly masked it with anger. "I saw the photo. You need to stop putting him online." "I didn't put him anywhere," Elara snapped. "But why does it even matter to you if he isn't yours?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Julian's jaw clenched. He looked around, acutely aware of his audience. "Because lies spread fast. You're trying to destroy my reputation." Elara took a step closer, her voice vibrating with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "Destroy you? You did that to yourself. You walked away. You denied him. You tried to erase him." Julian's aides shifted, ready to intervene, but he lifted a hand to silence them. His eyes were locked on Leo, who stared back with a calm, silver-blue certainty. The silence stretched until it was painful. Finally, Julian muttered, "This isn't over." He turned on his heel and left, the echo of his expensive shoes sharp and angry on the clinic's worn floor. Loretta came to Elara's side, her hand steady on her shoulder. "Child, you rattled him. Did you see it? He looked at that boy and for a second he couldn't hide the truth in his own face." Ilara exhaled, her body trembling. But he still left. He left with doubt in his pocket, Loretta said, her voice full of fierce conviction. And doubt, when it's planted in a heart of stone, can crack it wide open. That night, Ilara lay awake long after Leo had fallen asleep, listening to his soft, rhythmic breathing. She replayed every second of the confrontation in her mind. The way Julian had looked at their son, the pause, the hesitation, the fear behind the anger. She clung to it, even as a fresh wave of fear coiled tighter around her own chest. Across the city, in his glass-walled penthouse, Julian sat in darkness, staring at the same photograph on his phone. He zoomed in again and again, studying the boy's face until the lines blurred into a reflection of his own. He tried to drown the truth in expensive whiskey, but the storm in the child's eyes refused to be quenched. For the first time in years, Julian Vance didn't feel powerful. He felt hunted, not by scandal, not by the media, but by a truth he had tried and failed to outrun. And somewhere deep inside, he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that no amount of money, denial, or distance would keep it from finally finding him.